Hello again, it's Matt here from Christ the Rock. It's great to be able to share a little bit with you once more. For these next few thoughts for the day, we're going to be looking at a particular passage from the Bible that Steve introduced to us a couple of days ago. And it comes from the book of Micah. And this passage opens with this wonderfully pertinent question for God's people. And it's this: what does the Lord require of you? And I guess for all of us, that's an important question, whatever season of life we're in. And yet for this time in particular, I think it's an important one. As we deal with the continuing impact of the coronavirus, particularly on the most vulnerable, as we are becoming aware of the hazy future in front of us, where it's difficult to know what the next months and years ahead might look like. But in particular, and this is what Steve looked at recently, as we consider questions surrounding race, particularly in regards to inequality and prejudice and injustice, what does the Lord require of us? What is it that we're called to do as God's people at this time is a pertinent thing to consider. The opening to this short section, Micah begins with offering the wrong answer. He says these words. He says, "Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I come to him bowed down?" And these words might sound strange to us today, but essentially what we might read this as is of Micah saying, God, is it more religion that you want? Is it more religious activity that you desire? And whilst those things are important and are explored in other bits of the Old Testament, here God says something different. He says to Micah these well-known words in verse 8. He says, "You are to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And over the next three thoughts for the day, we're going to think about each of those phrases individually. But before we get into the first one, I just want to think for a moment about, as a whole, what is God saying there? He says he wants our actions, he wants our love, and he wants our walk. As we go through each of these phrases, we see perhaps a progression in what God is seeking. He starts with our actions, with how we behave with those around us. But then immediately he goes deeper to our hearts. He says it's about your motivation. It's the reason that you behave that's important as well. And then lastly, he goes even deeper still to our walk, our closeness, our intimacy with God. There's a sense, I think, in which what does the Lord require of us? Well, he requires us. He requires our whole at this time. And I wonder, just before we look for a moment at that first phrase, whether perhaps for some of us there have been things we've been holding back, particularly as the future is uncertain. Are there areas of our lives that perhaps we're holding on to, we're protecting for this moment because we're worried what tomorrow might look like? Whereas God's call is he wants you. He wants all of us for this time, for now. So this first phrase, God says he wants us to act justly. I think for one of the things that's convicted me about these past few weeks is that there's so much to take in about what justice looks like. There's so many articles to read. There's so many opinions swirling around on social media. There's so many terrible stories about the prejudice and difficulty many are facing. And yet what God says is it's not merely about what you think or even perhaps what we consider about these issues, but it's what we do. And what he wants us to do is to bring justice. One of Martin Luther King's most well-used Bible passages is from the book of Amos, where it speaks of God's justice coming like a mighty river through society. This sense of God's justice rolling through communities and homes and families. And for some of us, that might be quite a scary image. For some of us, we might think of justice as being like a court of law where criminals are given their rightful punishment. And yet the word actually that Micah uses here is the word mishpat, which is referring to God's covenant law. It's used extensively across books like Exodus and Leviticus as God outlines this way of life for his followers. And what we see, and this is probably a little bit broadly saying it, but what we see across these books is a deep concern of God for the poor. We see a deep concern for those who are without homes, an enormous concern for the sick. We see God's concern for the marginalised. We see God's real concern for how the Israelites treat foreigners and migrants. And we see God's concern for the sick. And so what we see here is not a kind of harsh justice that God is looking for. He's not looking for us to go out and necessarily judge the world, as to help and love the world. It means, I think, for me personally anyway, that God is concerned with what I do when I walk past somebody who is homeless. He's concerned with what I say if I perhaps hear people speaking in a derogatory fashion about someone else. He cares about my finances when I see another terrible story of the prejudice and inequality that many face. So and I know it's probably a little bit general, but I just want to challenge perhaps us as individuals at this moment to think back over these past couple of weeks and think, where have we been able to act justly? Where have we been able to live out some of that justice from God with those around us? And as we look forwards over these weeks ahead, what might we do to make sure we live in a way that is set apart, that is different, so that God's justice might come as a river for this nation at this time? Amen.